Jamie Beyer knew what she could be heading into, and she knew that she did not want to become caught up in somebody else's attempt at one of those viral moments. What she really wanted was to explain how an American farm family has benefited from an international trade deal. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Jamie seems pretty rare, or at least pretty rare to me, in that she is a tri-state farmer. Her farmland with her husband covers part of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We're going to talk about all that during our conversation, but Jamie is really here with us, and it's really the reason she traveled all the way to Washington, D.C., because she wants Congress and the president to know that the USMCA, the United States Mexico-Canada Agreement, that thing, she thinks it's worked, she wants to prove it, and she wants it to continue. Hi, Jamie. Thanks for connecting. How are you?
I'm doing well.
How is life? What is life like in June as we talk to you as the month comes to a close?
Well, in Minnesota, you're never guaranteed anything, and we have not gotten any heat. It's been quite disappointing. We only get 3 weeks of living, and we're getting, 3 months, and we're getting 1 month short this year. So we're looking forward to a little heat in the forecast next week for the 4th of July. And hopefully that comes just in time for all the growing crops too.
All right, let's talk about the crops. You have a diverse operation. You don't just focus on just one thing. Can you talk a little bit about what you all do?
Yeah, so my husband and I farm in west central Minnesota, and we grow soybeans, corn, sugar beets, alfalfa. We have a failed vineyard. Used to grow a little wheat, but these are pretty typical crops for where we are in Minnesota. We're not irrigators. We do have a lot of tiled ground, so we're usually dealing with excess moisture. That's our problem.
Oh, for sure. Can you talk a little bit about why you are diverse like you are? Why'd you go that route?
So crop rotation is pretty important for us to keep disease resistance down and to give the soil a break between different crops. We had an opportunity to interject alfalfa. The 80s, I think the 80s farm crisis chased out a lot of our livestock operations, and so
okay, you're way too young. There's no way.
Well, I remember the 80s.
You're probably barely born in the 80s.
I was there for it. It was a different world. Like these small towns were really gutted. I remember what town was like before all that happened. And anyway, it chased the livestock out of our county. And we've just recently had some, a couple of larger dairies move in, and it gave us an opportunity to grow alfalfa, I guess, for the first time. Beyond that, the sugar beets are kind of complicated in what you can grow ahead of them and how much time you have to have between growing them. They're a little bit pickier. And then corn and soybeans, I think, are such a brilliant mix, especially where we are in Minnesota, where it's so cold, and you have these crops that can perfectly be stored in winter weather and come out of it in the spring. It's so genius how it all really works together.
We have not talked nearly enough on this show since we started doing it 2.5 years ago about sugar beets. Do you mind, before we get into the kind of the meaty stuff that I wanted to talk to you about, can you talk a little bit about what does that entail? What are those like to grow?
Oh gosh, so they go in a little earlier than the rest of our crops. They like the cool temps in the beginning when they're before they've emerged. They're a high value specialty crop, or they have been in the past, I should say. Today's maybe a little bit different, but so on our farm, we have about 400 acres of those. And, they grow underground. It's just like a beet. They have a green leafy top that, depending on the weather, can develop funny things that need fungicides and that sort of thing. They kind of require a little bit more manual labor in weeding and that sort of thing. They're a little more sensitive. And then the interesting part is farmers here have created their own co-ops to process sugar beets. And so those are locally owned. You're a shareholder in those businesses. And so the whole community has harvest at the same time. It's a coordinated effort. So I didn't grow up on a farm. I had to learn everything I know about farming as an adult. And I don't know how many years my husband and I had been married and I'd been through harvest. And I said, "When does sugar beet harvest start?" And he goes, "October 1st. It starts October 1st. It always starts October 1st. It doesn't matter what the weather is. Usually, if it's too warm, they might delay it a little bit, but
Okay.
October 1st. So it's kind of a big boom in our little area because it
Sure.
requires a lot of labor, a lot of trucks, a lot of like excitement over that kind of harvest, because everybody's doing it together.
Okay, so just as some background for folks, generally before we start the recording every week, we do a little pre-talk, little pre-conversation. So full disclosure here, I was giving Jamie some grief about what makes her crazy enough to fly to Washington, D.C. and agree to talk to a bunch of politicians about a very passionate subject to you at a time that politics can be so cuckoo. Um, so you're out there talking about an international trade agreement as a person who feels directly connected to this, and like you mentioned, you married into the farming business. But before we really get knee deep into this, can you just please explain like why? Why do you want to put yourself through this? Because it's a lot easier not to get mixed up in politics.
So there's sort of this group of farmers who are very narrowly interested in policy
Mm,
and how, government programs touch the farm, from before you seed, the seed you use, the equipment you use, the programs, the crop insurance, harvest, trade, all of it, government touches all of it. And specifically in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota has been pretty heavy-handed over the past, I'd say, 12 years in their approach to agriculture. And so there were a couple of issues around 2016 that really got my husband and I pretty fired up. And it was one of these situations where farmers knew it was coming down the line, or some farmers knew that there were some water regulations that were going to be
mhm.
imposed. And so you try to do something about it because you think, well, they're not just going to do this without input from farmers, right? Oh, well, they will. And you spend a lot of your time just trying to convince other farmers it's going to happen, let alone trying to stop, bad policies from being implemented. And I'd say for my husband and I, it sort of radicalized us a little bit. I've always kind of worked in government off the farm part-time and full-time. And so that's always a natural interest of mine. But to have that intersect with agriculture was an interesting twist. And then I didn't know anything about the commodity world and their grower boards. And so in response to that sort of trauma, discovered this whole world of ag policy and how farmers volunteer their time to meet with legislators and influence government policies. I think, you've got Farm Bureau where I am, Farmers Union, you've got state and national corn, state and national soybean, sugar beet, wheat are kind of the big players in that where I am. And you kind of have the opportunity to fit your personality to
Mhm.
whatever group makes the most sense to you. I joined with the state soybean organization and just kind of went straight to the top because it was such an impactful organization where I could directly see kind of the fruits of your labor, see the changes that we could impact at the state level here. And as you kind of gain traction in some of these organizations, then they scoop you up into the national scene.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, overall, it's a little more frustrating because it's hard to see the changes that you can impact there.
Hmm.
It's more generational, I think, is the way you have to look at it. But like you said, wide swings and changes in administration can really
Hmm.
like upend anything you were working on or trying
Yeah.
to prevent from happening. It's an interesting field for sure.
Hey, and just to clarify, so like we're talking to you in Wheaton, Minnesota. Does your farm, you have like 37, 3,800? Is that about right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. And so do you it crosses over, is it all contiguous and does it cross over into South Dakota?
It takes my husband 90 miles to check all the fields. So
Okay.
we're pretty spread apart, but we're on the Minnesota border, we're into South Dakota, and then we process our sugar beets in North Dakota. So we get a taste of
Seriously.
every state. Yeah, it's kind of a fun area to be growing crops.
Okay, now this is making more sense. So you probably have to, so you're following what's going on, and
Mhm.
we are going to get to the DC thing, but you need to follow three different states for a statewide policy then?
Yeah, I mean, the Dakotas are pretty friendly overall, so
Okay.
usually you're not dealing with anything too new in South Dakota or North Dakota, but it does get a little complicated and like the accounting side of the world isn't easy, but we try our best. I think it highlights, the distinctions between states and it's so obvious when you live here. So there are a lot of, twin towns along the border
Mhm.
between Minnesota and the other two states. And those cities on the other side, they're always bigger. They've always got more economy. They've always got more going on. And so when you say to someone like, Minnesota state policies have an impact on the size of our cities, the type of housing you have, the type of agriculture that's being built and processed. It's a stark contrast. I think of there have been some biodiesel plants or crush plants that have been proposed in Minnesota, and they end up in North Dakota because they can get built quickly and cheaply, and they're up and running before Minnesota has even finished the permit application process.
So that would be most of the challenge for you in Minnesota is the regulation side of it. Like it's just too laborious, too time intensive, and that's what slows stuff down and makes it more
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah. And
Okay.
and it's frustrating because you'll have unanimous support for sustainable aviation fuel. You'll have the
Hmm.
headquarters of, well, a major, hub for Delta right here saying, how can we do it? How can we do it? And then you have the governor's support saying, hey, we'll try to speed track permitting, but it's still it's fast tracking, slow tracking. It's still slow. So it really kneecaps our market. So that's one less market that I have to market our products to.
Okay, so knowing all of that background, which now totally makes sense why they volunteered you to go to DC. So you're going to DC
Right.
to try to explain to members of Congress the importance of this international trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. And as you know, President Trump has talked about maybe we don't need this thing. Canada doesn't really buy anything from us or something like that. With him, sometimes it's tough, right? Because we're not, he can sometimes kind of negotiate out in the public in ways that maybe we haven't seen in previous presidents do. So you're kind of like, does he really think this? Does he not think this? Is he trying to, scare somebody, get some attention, whatever the heck. So as you're sitting there in DC, I'm very curious what you really wanted to express to these folks about why you think it's important that this trade agreement go forward. And then also kind of, I'm sure you're sort of looking around, reading the room and what the response was.
It was a unique experience. I hadn't testified before in front of the Ag Committee, so it was an honor to do that. Um, it's a kind of an interesting situation because we didn't have a lot to complain about,
Hmm.
which which sometimes it feels like you got a long list of complaints. But when it comes to USMCA, it seems like for the US soybean farmer, that's been a successful agreement that's allowed us to grow exports to Canada and Mexico. And it was one of the first, if not the first trade agreement to include some cooperative policies for biotechnology, for seed traits and that sort of thing. And wherever we can reduce timelines and costs for new technologies, that's huge for agriculture. It takes 13 years for a trait to get from the lab into a farmer's field. And so when we're talking about needs for drought resistance, disease resistance, higher yields, better protein and oil, like those, we want all those traits. But to wait, I mean, those will be for my children. we won't be able to use them on our farm and whatever they're
Yeah,
developing now. It's kind of frustrating. So to have USMCA be an agreement that tries to cut through those sorts of red tape is an interesting deal. I was involved with the American Soybean Association when it first was signed. And so it's interesting to, go back to the agreement and kind of review, oh yeah, that's what it did and that's why we liked it then, we like it now. I think it doesn't hit ag all the same way. And so you have
sure.
to just kind of stay in your little circle of I'm speaking on behalf of soybeans, but other entities and certainly ag partners that we want industries to be successful have different opinions and so I negotiators are going to negotiate. I think that's what we expect our president to do, and um, it is what it is.
I think when most people see clips of some of these hearings, like especially lately, it's more performative. You'll
Mhm.
have one party's hammering some leader of who really is aligned with the other party, and it's really, I mean, as the American citizen, you get very little out of it, and you don't get a lot of answers, and it's just they're going for zingers back and forth or whatever. In this setting, especially generally speaking, these those types of hearings where you are don't really have that kind of tension and spice and all that kind of stuff. Did you feel like the members in the room were they asking you questions like in a learning process where they were trying to find out more information, or did they really ask you a lot of stuff?
And that's a good question. I had when you're in DC, sometimes you have a little downtime, and so I
Hmm.
had snuck into a hearing before, and it was when Merrick Garland was there, and it was like you said, it was just pure theater. Like
Yeah.
it literally looked like a stage where people come in from the stage left and they're heading stage
Yeah,
right. Like it actually does look like that. And I think, I was worried about that gotcha moment. Are
for
they going to
sure.
try to do that? I think there's certainly some hearings that some of my colleagues have had to attend, like on pesticides
Hmm.
or on biofuels that feel a little closer to that. We knew going into this one it was a friendly hearing. And so it was, like I say, it was good practice because the questions were a little bit softball. But what struck me while I was sitting there is that some of the questions were getting kind of complicated. And I'm like, shoot, this is AI helping. And now, now I don't have AI to help on my side.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
overall, I think most people were interested in maybe just giving a little prompt to maybe their state agriculture and making sure that that got on the record, kind of a nod to home on how has hit them. I think too, they you're in a room that could potentially hold like 70 people, but only two or three are there at one time. And so they
Mm.
come in, they ask their question, they're off to something else.
Hmm.
And there were a couple of members that were there to make sound bites for their social media and
Sure.
they got it and left and that's the way it went.
That isn't that annoying?
I I mean, I don't know.
You do,
It's
or do
it's
you just know
interesting.
it is
It's
what it is? And
interesting. Yeah, it's opening up a world. I think it's so interesting in what I've been involved with, where people really didn't care much about politics. You maybe heard about it in a little teeny tiny blip in the news or in the paper once a day, and now it's like you say, you're just like bombarded with
hmm.
these clips and clips and clips, and so people are more interested in it. I don't know that we're any smarter for it,
Seriously.
but we're
That's why we
certainly
try to
seeing
do
a
a
lot.
30-minute show here so that we can actually get into some depth, but I totally appreciate what you're saying. So like, do you feel like, I mean, was it worth it? You've got, you flew out there, right?
Yeah, it's overnight in a hotel and you see more
Yeah.
of the airport than you do, but to me it's always the things you learn along the way. So
Yeah.
like, even if we were going to talk about USMCA, I have 9 of my own handwritten notes. Like, I don't know, it gives you a chance to learn about these things and I
Okay.
always like my participation on the farm is kind of limited to the things that I'm interested in and can physically do. So this is one thing that I can do. I can sit in meetings. I can bring the perspective of what it's like in the field into that office and really, I think, translate. I find a lot of farmers are so technical in their thinking and, they're 3 or 4 generations deep on their knowledge.
Hmm.
So sometimes kind of dumbing it down for people isn't easy. And I can do that. I can I've got that ear. So when my husband's talking about, well, I we had a trade group come out from they were from Asia and Africa, and the farmer was talking about after harvest how much trash is in the field, and this is what you have to
Mm.
do to deal with the trash. And I said, okay, he doesn't mean garbage.
Yeah.
He's talking about corn stalks, just
Yeah.
little things like that where you're
Yep.
like, oh, or when you're talking about pesticides, just to remind people, like we're only going out, twice to spray pesticides on soybeans. That's it. I mean, and this is how much water is in that tank. Little things like that my husband, takes for granted. That's like, you know, baseline information for him that he doesn't think he maybe needs to convey, but sometimes you got
Hmm.
to back up many steps to meet a legislator where they're at. They may or may not have, been to a farm before even.
And a little background about your husband. How long, so does he go back generations with your farm?
Yeah. Yep. So great grandpa
Okay.
started the farm, and then Grandpa George and his dad and himself. And he he recently had to host some people out for some pictures, and it had been a while since we cleaned up the yard. And his dad, when he was alive, had kind of put out some of the horse-drawn machenery, the plow and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And it had tipped over, and I didn't really even look at it. And I put it up, and it was upside down. And he's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I knew that. I don't know why I did that, but so certainly like the ghost of the ghost of the farmers before us are still on the farm in a very
Sure.
real way. Hmm.
But hey, you've mentioned this a couple of times now that when you look at a lot of these things, and I appreciate that you're dealing with stuff, some things maybe impact you immediately when you're dealing with regulations and all that kind of stuff. But you talked about some of the stuff you're advocating for, trying to explain to people all those things is really more likely going to affect your kids than it is you and your husband. How do you stay in that longer term focus when we look more broadly at our country where we have tons of families who are struggling trying to make a go of things? And I don't want to get into your personal life, but you work off farm too, right?
Yeah, yep,
And
yeah.
while that may fire up your professional interest to be able to do that, a lot of people frankly
Yeah,
they have no choice, right? And
yeah,
one or both
yep,
of the
yep,
if it's a married couple, one or both work off farm,
right,
which is not
right.
ideal.
Yeah.
So how do you both balance advocating for stuff that needs to take hold like right away versus the longer term?
I think the ag world necessitates it because the issues can be so close at hand. We go out to DC every July for the American Soybean Association and visit legislators, and it's always interesting the the issue that'll pop up last minute. And so one year it was a requirement that all ships that handle imported product have a U.S. flag or be built in the U.S. So we all had to hurry up and learn a lot about that
Mm,
to avoid like a really immediate supply crunch. This year, it'll probably be the Senate's Farm Bill is, just released here this week. And
sure.
so we'll have to become really experts at that. But those sorts of things have a more immediate impact and they get mixed in with the bigger issues. So I can't tell you how many years we've been advocating for expansion of aquaculture in the US and being
Hmm.
able to permit farms off the coast of Louisiana or Florida or wherever. And you just keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it. And everybody supports it. Nobody has a problem with it. Well, why can't we get these things permitted?
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know. It's hard to predict what's going to be, okay, we fixed it. Or,
Hmm.
nope, this is going to drag on for 12 years.
Hmm. Which has to be maddening, especially when you find things that are so essentially universally backed to try to bust through the bureaucracy and the slow moving, would you call it slow track, fast track, or whatever term you use? Like that has to be maddening.
Yeah, and then you have a layer of like what the states can do.
Hmm.
So you might have a handle on managing a certain subject at the federal level, and then all of a sudden California comes in and just like upends the whole thing or a
Hmm.
lawsuit, and then you're kind of battling this on, the state front instead of just a national venue. It's always interesting, I guess. But I think, you get little tidbits that what you're doing matters. Sometimes, you know, there's a group of like 60 or 70 of us farmers on the board, and sometimes you lose a little faith, but we don't all do that at the same time. So you
Sure.
kind of carry each other when things aren't as optimistic, and farming is a long-term view. You're already thinking about how you're going to leave it for the next generation, and so you don't get too hung up on the year to year sort of situation. You keep the big plan in mind.
Okay, so let me put you on the spot a little bit, thinking the here and now. And I just read this week how, roughly speaking, maybe a third of the revenue coming in for a lot of family farmers will be in the form of federal direct payments.
Yeah.
Like, that's a big old chunk, right? And not sustainable for a bunch of reasons. So, is there anything you can advocate for that will help change that to make it more profitable for these family farms?
I think this administration is doing a good job of recognizing that. Brooke Rollins just announced some regenerative
Hmm.
ag credits for farmers that are around biofuel plants. So folks that have those in their backyard could qualify for a premium. I think if we can get the sustainable aviation fuel, domestic usage is what we're really
Hmm.
looking for. And so the more beans we can use here, the more corn we can use here. We move the pile here, the more we can control and not be disrupted by, politics and trade agreements and international affairs. I think, we've had some really strong renewable fuel standards recently released, and those maybe haven't trickled through directly to the farm yet. Those sorts of incentives and tax incentives with 45Z. Everything is like stacked to look pretty good if we can if we can
Yeah.
endure and get there.
But like, that's the hard part, right? And this is not a criticism of the current administration, but any administration, right?
Yeah.
They put out some kind of announcement, some kind of press release, and it's glowing and it's transformational, and this is like the greatest thing ever. And it's hard. I mean, sometimes it's hard to know unless you're really like truly deep in it. It's hard to know as a more passive bystander reading this stuff. You're like, okay, like, does this matter? Does this not matter? Like, is it going to kick in? How fast can it kick in? Is it really what they claim it's going to be? So, like, do you feel like what you've seen here recently, some of this stuff will matter, and in what way?
It all adds to that baseline. I think it agriculture is interesting because you can manage a a portion of your risk.
Hmm.
You can maybe you can put some storage in. Maybe you're interested in marketing a little bit more aggressively than you're not. It has a wide range of how you want to kind of hedge. We don't have livestock on my farm, but that's another way that you can sort of diversify
Hmm.
and make sure all your eggs aren't literally in one basket. But
Yeah.
there's just so many aspects to it. I think of like the first time I saw the Farm Bill. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's like a book like this. And
Yeah.
I think there are two volumes. You know, you can get something passed, but the bureaucrats have to get that all rolled out into programs, and so maybe you got a beginning farmer credit packaged and signed into whatever needs into law or
Hmm.
whatever, and it won't really be implemented for 4 or 5 years because they have to have software, they have to have applications, they have to have reviews, all of that. Um, so I think we're just looking for that trend to be upward, in general, because
Yeah.
there's just too many details to manage to say, oh, that actually, hit my bank account.
I wish that this shows how naive and pie in the sky I am, but like, we have so many really deep issues that have plagued our country for a long time, and they're so complex and so complicated. But I'm just thinking about the experience you just had in DC. I just wish that we could simplify this process for Americans where, like, Congress would take one piece, whether it's ag or anything else, and like, this is the focus for the week. like bring in smart people like what you just went through, like bring in smart people from across the country, have like legit question and answer sessions with smart people to be like, hey, we're thinking about doing this. How would this affect your farm? You know, whatever. And then like that's the focus for like that week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever. Let's say regenerative, like that's the thing. So here's what needs to be involved on the federal government side. Let's all get together. Let's pass something. Here's the funding for it. And then we move to the next thing. And I know I'm crazy because that's not the way the process works, but it's like it gets so hard. And I appreciate having people on like you to talk about some of this stuff, but it's still just so complex. Like you talked about sustainable aviation fuel. Why can't that be a focus for like a week long? Like pros, the
Well,
cons, the whatever. Here's what it can do for us. What should the governments involved be in it on the state level, on the federal level? And then let's do it one way or the other and let's move forward.
I think one big lesson is no matter what you're lobbying for, there's someone lobbying against you.
Totally.
And so you don't always know who's doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it's a messy, disorganized deal. I work in local government and that can be disorganized and things happen
Yeah.
in the wrong order
Yeah.
but overall I find that usually local government ends up getting it right, kind of accidentally on purpose. They kind of get it right. And as you get away from your constituents, at the state level, ours are in St. Paul, that's 3 to 8 hours away from, their constituents. It gets watered down, and then you're talking federal and it's even more watered down. They just maybe don't have that really direct feedback of a mayor in a small town and they make a decision and he's getting calls that night after
Yeah.
the meeting saying that
Yep.
was a mistake, that instant feedback of where you're kind of going off track. I don't know what to tell you. I think we've gotten to travel a little bit, my husband and I, on behalf of some of these ag organizations and with the goal of opening up markets in other countries. And, the US is so far ahead in so many fronts. Like our transportation system, our marketing system, our storage systems, our ports. It's we're so lucky to have advanced as much as we have, and the equipment we have, the seeds we have, the technology. We're in a really great spot to help the rest of the world if we can get our products out to them.
For sure. Hey, I wanted to wrap up with one thing. When I was prepping for this conversation with you, I have a cheat sheet that I keep next to me, but you are and have been involved in so many things locally. Now, you just talked about the international travel you've done with your husband and that for a variety of things. Can you just talk about why, when I look at different communities across the country, especially in these smaller communities, there are people like you who step up to do a bunch of different stuff. It's one thing to serve on like your church board or watershed or whatever, hear a one thing and make that your focus. You are doing and have done a ton of different stuff in your region. Can you talk about like why is your family involved in so many different things, and kind of more broadly how that benefits your community?
I think small communities like ours, so my town is 1,400 people, no stoplight. Um, you have to fulfill a lot of roles just because the numbers aren't there. So, you've got volunteer firemen, you've got volunteer EMTs, you have all the service organizations, and you have to kind of do it all. And you don't get off those boards unless you're dead. And even then they keep you keep you on. I just talked to someone yesterday. They're like, well, this person has passed away and they're still on this board. I'm like, see, you can't,
You can't
never
leave.
letting you off. I think they're just out of this world opportunities in these small towns. And something that kind of warms my heart a little bit is these kids have figured it out. I think under COVID, they saw the freedoms they could have in these smaller communities and they want to come back. And so trying to make room for them and making sure they are getting college degrees that fit in the communities that they want to live in, so they're not chasing, careers that you can't bring back home if that's what they choose to do. And so it's been kind of a neat experience right now to have these, they're not quite adults yet. Their brains aren't done forming quite yet, but they're getting close, and they see the value and the opportunity in these smaller spaces.
Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciate the insight into all of this, and thanks for what you're doing to be a voice beyond your borders. We really appreciate the conversation.
I'm glad we could finally connect. Yes.
Indeed. Thank you.
As we recorded this, President Trump has apparently decided to let the current trade deal expire, at least for now. Now, we will have what the president said about this deal back when he signed it during his first term in office back in 2018 versus what he is saying more recently in the summer of 2026. They are not the same thing. You can find those comments in the weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. It's the place where landowners get their news about key policy matters, land value trends, and interviews with top thought leaders. You can find it right now at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us here this week on the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.